A rifle cracked in the distance. The sound echoed across the dry plains of Deadwood, carrying on the hot wind. Smoke rose from where the shot had been fired, a dark plume against the harsh blue sky. This story is a work of fiction, crafted by AI. But the injustice it depicts, that's older than memory. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back to the moment it all started. They had Arabella's father pinned against the wall of his own home. Rough hands held his thin arms. His face was pale with fear. The dust from the floor clung to his worn trousers. "That paper isn't real," Arabella screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "You forged it. Everyone knows it." The men in Silas Crane's employ just laughed. One of them snatched a document from the table, waving it in the air like a trophy. The family's future, their entire lives, had been reduced to that single piece of paper. Deadwood was dying. The drought had lasted 3 years now. The creek that once watered the homesteads had shrunk to a muddy trickle, but Silas Crane's ranch still had water. His men guarded the irrigation gates with rifles. They controlled the wells. They controlled who ate and who starved. Arabella Blackwood watched from her window as her 3 children huddled together on the floor. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Their small bellies ached with emptiness. Tears had dried on their cheeks, leaving tracks in the dust on their faces. The blockade had been in place for a week now. No food deliveries, no water from the creek, just the relentless sun beating down on their desperate situation. The stranger rode into town as the sun reached its peak. His horse moved slowly, deliberately. The bright red bandana around his neck stood out against the dusty landscape. His eyes scanned the street, taking in every detail. He noticed the boarded-up windows of 3 homesteads. He noticed the armed men standing guard outside the largest ranch. He noticed the fear in the eyes of the townspeople who hurried past him without meeting his gaze. He stopped at the general store. The proprietor wouldn't meet his eyes either. "Can't sell you no supplies," the man muttered, wiping his hands on his apron. "Not with Silas running things." The stranger didn't argue. He just nodded and walked out. He mounted his horse again and rode toward the edge of town. There he could see the homesteads, small patches of struggling crops, withering in the heat. And there, at the farthest one, he saw a woman standing in her doorway, watching the road with desperate hope in her eyes. The stranger turned his horse and rode toward that homestead. The closer he got, the clearer he could see the children inside. They were thin, too thin. Their ribs showed through their thin shirts. Their eyes were wide with hunger. Arabella saw him coming. She straightened her shoulders, trying to look strong. She didn't want him to see how desperate she was. But when he stopped in front of her gate, she couldn't hold back the tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They haven't eaten in 2 days. The stranger didn't speak. He just looked at her. Then he looked at the children. Then he looked back toward town, toward the source of their suffering. "The water," Arabella explained, her voice trembling. "Silas controls it all. He's starving us out. He wants our land. He stole my husband's deed." The stranger's gaze was steady. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He just listened. "My father tried to fight back," Arabella continued, her voice growing stronger. He confronted Silas about the forged documents. Silas sent his men. They took him away. They took everything. The stranger's hand rested on the lever of his rifle, not threatening, just ready. "The deed," he said finally. His voice was low, calm. "Where was it last seen?" Arabella looked down at her hands. "In my father's desk, before they took him. Before they took everything." The stranger nodded. He turned his horse toward town again. "Wait," Arabella called after him. "Where are you going?" The stranger didn't answer. He just rode away, toward the heart of the injustice, toward Silas Crane's ranch, toward a confrontation that would change everything for the family that had nothing left to lose. The stranger rode toward Silas Crane's ranch with purpose in his movements. The sun beat down on his shoulders, but he didn't notice the heat. His focus was entirely on the road ahead, on the injustice that awaited him. He could still see Arabella's face in his mind, pale with worry, eyes filled with tears for her children. He could still hear her voice, breaking as she spoke of the deed that had been stolen. The stranger stopped at the edge of Silas's property. The ranch was sprawling, with freshly painted fences and healthy crops irrigated by water that should have been shared. The contrast with Arabella's withering homestead was stark. Men patrolled the perimeter, rifles in hand. They watched him approach with suspicion. "Name your business," one of them called out, stepping forward. The stranger didn't answer. He just continued riding, his steady gaze fixed on the main house. The men exchanged uneasy looks, but didn't challenge him further. Word had already spread through town about the quiet man with the red bandana who asked questions no one else dared to ask. Silas Crane emerged from the house as the stranger dismounted. He was a large man, with a belly that spoke of wealth and a beard that couldn't hide the cruelty in his eyes. "You're the one asking questions about the Blackwood place," Silas stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The stranger nodded. "I've heard things." "The Blackwoods are squatters," Silas said, a smirk playing on his lips. "They never had proper papers. I'm just reclaiming what's rightfully mine." The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly. The deed Arabella's husband left her. Silas's smile faded. "That document is meaningless. It was never properly filed, never witnessed correctly. I have the official papers now." The stranger didn't move. He didn't flinch. "Show me." Silas laughed. "You don't give orders here, stranger. This is my land, my town, my rules." The stranger took a step closer. "Show me the papers." The tension between them was palpable. Silas's men shifted their weight, hands moving closer to their weapons. But Silas held up a hand, stopping them. "Very well," Silas said, with a sneer. "Follow me." Inside the ranch house, everything spoke of wealth. Thick rugs, polished furniture, imported decorations. Silas led the stranger to a heavy oak desk in his study. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a document. "This," Silas said, tapping the paper, "is the only deed that matters, the one that proves the Blackwoods never had a claim to that land." The stranger studied the document. The paper looked old, but the signature seemed off somehow. The ink was too dark, too fresh. The paper itself had been stored in a way that didn't match its supposed age. "The Blackwoods owned that land for 15 years, the stranger said, his voice flat. "They built a home there. They planted crops. They raised their children." Silas shrugged. Irrelevant. Without proper papers, it's just land waiting for someone with vision to make use of it. The stranger looked up from the document, his gaze intense. What happens if the real deed surfaces? Silas's face hardened. Nothing, because it won't. The original was destroyed when the Blackwoods proved unable to protect their interests. The stranger didn't believe him. There was something here he was missing, something important. Arabella's children are starving, the stranger said, changing the subject, because you control the water. The drought affects everyone, Silas replied, though without much conviction. Some people just suffer more than others. The stranger turned to leave, but stopped at the door. This isn't over. Silas laughed again. Of course it is. You're leaving town tomorrow, like all the others who thought they could challenge me. The stranger didn't answer. He walked out of the house and mounted his horse, his mind racing. The deed was the key, the real deed. If he could find it, he could restore justice to Arabella and her children. But where would it be, and who would risk helping him find it? As he rode back toward town, the stranger made a decision. He would need help, someone who knew the truth about Silas's operations, someone who might be willing to risk everything for what was right. The question was, who could he trust in a town where fear ruled everything? The stranger rode toward the homestead with purpose in his stride. The sun beat down on his shoulders, but he barely felt it. His mind was focused on the family waiting at the edge of town. He could see the small house from a distance, a weathered structure that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, but it was a thin, uncertain smoke that spoke more of desperation than sustenance. As he approached, he could hear the sounds before he saw them. The faint cries of children, the weary sigh of a woman trying to be strong. Arabella stood in the doorway, her frame thin against the harsh light. She straightened when she saw him approaching, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the worry etched around her eyes. The stranger dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. The wood was splintered and dry, like everything else in this drought-stricken place. He walked slowly toward the house, giving her time to speak if she wanted. The children haven't had proper food in 3 days, Arabella said, before he could ask. Her voice was steady but thin, like paper stretched too tight. They're weak. They cry in their sleep. The stranger nodded. He could see it now, the way the children's ribs showed through their thin shirts, the hollow look in their eyes, the way they clung to their mother's skirts when he came closer. One small boy, no more than 6, stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. I saw Silas, the stranger said, keeping his voice low and even. He has papers claiming the land is his. Arabella's hands clenched into fists at her sides. They're forged. My husband and I built that house with our own hands. We planted those crops. We raised our children there. The stranger didn't offer false comfort. He didn't promise things would get better. He simply asked the question that mattered most. The deed, he said. Where did you last see it? Arabella looked away, toward the horizon, as if searching for memories in the dust-filled air. It was in my father's desk, the big oak one in the corner of the main room. After my husband passed, I kept all important papers there. The land deed, birth certificates, marriage license. Everything. She turned back to face him, tears glistening in her eyes, but not falling. The night Silas's men came, they took my father. They ransacked the house. That's when the deed disappeared. I tried to stop them. I tried to fight. Her voice trailed off. The shame of helplessness hung in the air between them. The stranger looked past her into the small house. It was sparsely furnished. A few chairs, a table, a bed in the corner. Everything looked worn and used, cared for, but inadequate. "Your father?" the stranger asked. "Where is he now?" Arabella's expression hardened. "Silas has him locked up in the jail. Says he's being held for disturbing the peace, but we all know why. Because he wouldn't lie about the deed." The stranger nodded slowly. He understood now. The deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the key to everything. Without it, Arabella had no legal claim to the land she and her husband had built their lives on. With it, she might have a chance. "I need to find that deed," the stranger said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to know where it might be." Arabella looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes despite everything. "Why would you do this? What's in it for you?" The stranger met her gaze directly. "Justice," he said simply. "That's all." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Arabella studied his face, looking for deception, for some hidden motive, but all she saw was determination, a quiet, steady resolve that matched the red bandana at his throat. "He kept copies of everything," she said finally, her voice gaining strength. "Important papers, receipts, letters. He was meticulous. Maybe there's something in his old medical bag. He was a doctor before he retired. He kept his instruments and papers in a leather bag." The stranger nodded. "Where would I find it?" "The sheriff's office," Arabella said, her voice dropping. "That's where they took him. That's where they'd have his things." The stranger turned toward town, his mind already working. The sheriff's office was Silas's territory. Getting in there would be risky, but if there was even a chance of finding something that could help Arabella, he had to try. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "Keep the children close. I'll be back." Arabella watched as he mounted his horse and rode back toward town, leaving her with a fragile hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. The dust from his horse's hooves settled slowly in the still air, and for the first time in a long while, Arabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might get better for her family. The stranger rode toward the sheriff's office with a sense of purpose that cut through the dusty air. The sun beat down on his shoulders, but he barely noticed the heat. His mind was focused on the task ahead, finding Doc Elmer's medical bag and any information it might contain about the original land deed. The town seemed unnaturally quiet as he approached the law building, the only sound being the rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth. The sheriff's office was a small, unassuming building with a faded sign hanging above the door. Two men stood outside, rifles in hand. They watched him approach with wary eyes, their hands resting near their weapons, but not quite touching them. The stranger dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Can I help you?" one of them asked, his voice rough. "I'm looking for Doc Elmer," the stranger said. "I understand he's being held here." The men exchanged glances. "The doc ain't receiving visitors," the other man said, stepping slightly forward. The stranger nodded. "I understand, but I need his medical bag. It contains some important papers that might help clear up a misunderstanding." The first man scoffed. "Misunderstandings are what got him locked up in the first place. Silas don't want no misunderstandings." The stranger didn't flinch. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to see the bag." The men hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and avoiding confrontation. Finally, one of them sighed and gestured toward the door. "Fine, but make it quick and don't touch nothing else." Inside, the sheriff's office was cramped and dimly lit. The air smelled of stale coffee and unwashed bodies. Doc Elmer sat in a corner, his face pale, but his eyes alert. He looked up as the stranger entered, a flicker of hope in his gaze, before being quickly suppressed. "Doc," the stranger said quietly, "I need your medical bag. There might be something in it that could help you." Doc Elmer shook his head slightly. "They've already gone through it. Twice. Took anything that might be important." The stranger approached slowly. "What did they take?" "The deed," Doc Elmer whispered, his voice barely audible. "They knew what they were looking for." The stranger's gaze sharpened. "Where is it now?" Doc Elmer looked around nervously. "Silas has it, hidden in his safe. He thinks it's gone for good." The stranger nodded. "How did he know about it?" "He had someone on the inside," Doc Elmer said, glancing toward the door where the two men stood guard. "Someone who worked for my clinic, saw me filing the papers years ago. Silas paid him well to keep quiet and to report if anything surfaced." The stranger's jaw tightened. "Who was it?" Doc Elmer hesitated, then leaned closer. "Deputy Cal Pierce. He's been working for Silas for years. Pretends to be loyal to the law, but he's just another hired hand." The stranger absorbed this information, filing it away for later use. "And the deed itself, is there any way to get it?" Doc Elmer shook his head. "The safe is in Silas's office. Heavy iron combination lock. Only he knows the combination. And he has men guarding it day and night." The stranger straightened up as the two deputies moved closer. "Thank you, Doc. I appreciate your help." As he turned to leave, one of the deputies blocked his path. "That's far enough, stranger. Time for you to move along." The stranger didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked out, mounting his horse and riding away from the sheriff's office. His mind was racing now, putting together the pieces of Silas's operation, the forged documents, the controlled water supply, the bribed deputy. It all pointed to a carefully constructed scheme to steal land from vulnerable homesteaders. He rode toward Silas's ranch, knowing that's where he would find the safe containing the original deed. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. As he approached the ranch, he could see more men patrolling the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the fading light. The stranger dismounted and moved cautiously through the shadows, staying out of sight as much as possible. He circled the main house, looking for any weakness in the security. He found what he was looking for at the back, a small unguarded window that had been left slightly ajar. Slipping inside, he found himself in a storage room filled with farming equipment and supplies. The air smelled of dust and oil. He moved quietly through the connecting door into the main office, his eyes scanning the room for the safe. There it was, a large iron safe in the corner of the room, heavy and imposing, with a combination dial on the front. The stranger approached it cautiously, running his hands over the cold metal surface. It was solid, well made. Breaking it open would be difficult, if not impossible. He pulled out a small toolkit from his saddlebag and got to work, examining the lock mechanism carefully. He had opened safes before, but this one was different, more sophisticated, with additional security features. As he worked, the minutes ticked by, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Suddenly, he heard voices approaching the office. Panic flashed through him as he realized he was running out of time. He quickly stuffed his tools back into his bag and melted back into the shadows, just as the door opened and Silas Crane entered the room with two of his men. The stranger held his breath as they moved around the office, their voices carrying clearly through the stillness. Silas was talking about the homesteaders, about how they would all be gone by the end of the week. The stranger could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the cruel enjoyment of watching people suffer. As they left the room, locking the door behind them, the stranger slipped back out through the window and mounted his horse, riding away into the gathering darkness. He had failed to get the deed, but he had learned something important. Silas was planning to move against the other homesteaders next. The stranger knew he couldn't let that happen. He needed to find another way to get the deed, and he needed to do it before Silas made his move. The stranger rode slowly through the dusty streets of Deadwood, his mind racing with plans. He needed to get to Doc Elmer again, to see if there was another way to access the deed. As he turned onto the main road, 4 men stepped out from between buildings, blocking his path. They weren't subtle about it, rifles in hand, faces hard with determination. "Mr. Crane wants to have a word with you," the leader said, a scar running down his cheek. The stranger didn't answer. He just looked at them, his hand resting near his rifle, but not drawing it yet. He could see the nervousness in their eyes. They weren't professional gunslingers, just ranch hands doing what they were told. "He's not interested in talking," the stranger said finally. "Move aside." The leader smirked. "You're leaving town, one way or another." Before the stranger could react, 2 men charged him from the side. He moved quickly, drawing his rifle and knocking one man's shot wide with the barrel. The other man's shot went wild as the stranger sidestepped, bringing the butt of his rifle down hard on the man's shoulder. The man cried out in pain and stumbled back. Gunfire erupted from the other 2 men. The stranger dove behind a water trough as bullets ricocheted off the wooden sides. Water splashed around him as he scrambled for cover. His horse panicked and bolted down the street, leaving him stranded. "You should have stayed out of this," the leader called out, reloading his rifle. The stranger peeked out just long enough to take a quick shot. The bullet hit the ground near the man's feet, kicking up dirt. The man ducked back behind cover, cursing under his breath. The stranger counted 3 opponents now, the leader and 2 others. They were spread out, trying to surround him. He needed a way out, but more importantly, he needed to send a message back to Silas. "Tell Silas I'm not leaving," the stranger called out, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "Tell him this is personal now." Another volley of shots hit the trough, splintering the wood. The stranger felt a hot sting as a piece of shrapnel grazed his arm. He ignored the pain, focusing on the fight. "You're done here, stranger," one of them shouted. No one messes with Silas Crane and walks away. The stranger spotted an opportunity as one of the men moved to get a better angle. He fired quickly, the bullet hitting the man's rifle and knocking it from his grasp. The man scrambled for cover, cursing as he went. The firefight continued for several minutes, neither side gaining an advantage. The stranger knew he couldn't stay here forever. Eventually Silas would send more men, or worse, come himself. He needed to end this now. As the leader leaned out to take another shot, the stranger fired. The bullet hit the man's shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped to the ground, clutching his wound. The remaining two men hesitated, looking at their fallen leader. That was all the opening the stranger needed. He stood up quickly, leveling his rifle at them. "Go back to Silas," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Tell him the stranger is coming for him. Tell him I'm coming for the deed." The men didn't need to be told twice. They dropped their rifles and ran, disappearing down a side alley as fast as their legs would carry them. The stranger waited a moment longer, scanning the street to make sure they were really gone. Blood was now running down his arm from the shrapnel wound, but it wasn't serious. More concerning was the fact that Silas now knew he was a threat. As he started to walk toward Doc Elmer's house, a new determination settled over him. This wasn't just about helping Arabella anymore. Silas had tried to kill him. The line had been crossed. Now the stranger was coming for the deed, and there would be no turning back. The sun was beginning to set as he reached Doc Elmer's small house. The doctor was waiting for him, worry etched on his face. "I heard the gunfire," Doc Elmer said, opening the door quickly. "What happened?" The stranger walked through the door, his expression grim. "Silas sent his men. They tried to kill me." Doc Elmer's eyes widened. "You're hurt." "Just a scratch," the stranger said, showing him the wound on his arm. "But it's worse than that. Now Silas knows I'm not going away." The doctor nodded slowly. "Then we need to move faster before he decides to send more men. Or worse." The stranger looked at him, his gaze intense. "I need to get that deed from Silas's safe, and I need to do it before he makes his move against the other homesteaders." Doc Elmer hesitated, then looked around nervously. "There might be a way, but it's dangerous, and it involves Deputy Cal Pierce." The stranger raised an eyebrow. "The deputy who's been working for Silas?" "The same one," Doc Elmer confirmed. "But he's not happy with what Silas is doing, especially not after what he saw yesterday." "What did he see?" "The water diversion," Doc Elmer said, lowering his voice. "Silas isn't just controlling the water. He's been diverting it from the other homesteaders to his own ranch for years. The original deed has proof of that." The stranger's jaw tightened. "Then we need to get that deed, and we need to do it tonight, before anyone else gets hurt." As they made their plans, the stranger knew this was no longer just about justice. It was personal now. And Silas Crane was about to learn that when you cross the stranger, there's no going back. The stranger moved through the streets of Deadwood under the cover of darkness, his red bandana barely visible in the moonlight. Doc Elmer had given him Deputy Cal Pierce's address, a small house on the edge of town, away from Silas's influence, but not far enough to be safe. The house was dark when he approached, with only a single candle burning in the front window. The stranger knocked softly, 3 quick taps, then waited. He could hear movement inside, then the sound of a window being slid open cautiously. "Who's there?" a voice called out, tense and nervous. "The stranger," he replied. "I need to talk to Cal Pierce." There was a long pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened just enough for Cal to see who was there. He was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "What do you want?" Cal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The deed," the stranger said simply. "The original one Arabella's husband had, the one Silas stole." Cal's eyes widened with fear. "I can't help you with that. Silas will kill me if he finds out I talked." "I know what Silas has been doing," the stranger said, keeping his voice low. "I know about the water diversion, the illegal diversion from the homesteaders to his ranch." Cal's face paled. "How do you know about that?" "The original deed has proof," the stranger said. "Arabella needs that deed to save her family. Her children are starving because of what Silas is doing." Cal looked around nervously, then opened the door wider. "Come inside, but be quiet. My wife doesn't need to be involved in this." The stranger stepped into the small house. It was sparsely furnished, but clean. Cal's wife sat in a corner chair, her face pale with fear. "She knows," Cal said, his voice strained. "I told her everything last night after what I saw." The stranger nodded. "I need your help, Cal. I need you to tell me where Silas keeps the original deed." Cal shook his head. "I don't know. Silas keeps it in his safe. Only he knows the combination." "But you've seen it," the stranger pressed. "You've seen the deed. You know it exists." Cal hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I helped Silas forge the fake papers, but I kept a copy of the original before I handed it over. I hid it in my medical bag at the clinic." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Why would you risk that?" "I didn't know what Silas was planning at first," Cal said, his voice trembling. "When I found out about the water diversion, I couldn't be part of that. Not after seeing what it's doing to the homesteaders." The stranger studied Cal's face, looking for deception. But all he saw was fear and regret, the look of a man trapped by his own choices. "Where's your medical bag now?" the stranger asked. "At the clinic," Cal replied. "But Silas has men watching it. He knows I might talk." The stranger nodded. "Then we'll get it tonight." "While Silas is occupied with other matters." Cal looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You really think we can expose him? Really stop him?" The stranger didn't answer. He just turned and walked out, leaving Cal and his wife to their thoughts. The stranger had what he needed now, a way to get the original deed. But he knew Silas wouldn't make it easy. The confrontation was coming. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The stranger moved through the darkness toward the clinic. Cal, following nervously behind him. The night air was thick with tension, each step forward feeling heavier than the last. They reached the small building without incident, the moon casting long shadows across the dusty street. The medical bag was exactly where Cal said it would be, tucked behind a stack of old medical journals on a shelf in the back room. The stranger retrieved it quickly, his movements practiced and efficient. He didn't bother opening it there. They needed to be somewhere safe when they examined its contents. Doc Elmer's house, the stranger said, already heading for the door. It's the only place Silas wouldn't dare search. Cal nodded, relief washing over his face. Thank you. I didn't know what else to do. The stranger didn't answer. He just kept walking, his mind focused on the task ahead. They reached Doc Elmer's house in minutes, the doctor opening the door before they even knocked. I heard you were coming, Doc Elmer said, stepping aside to let them in. What did you find? The stranger placed the medical bag on the table and opened it. Inside, along with various medical instruments, was a folded document. He carefully removed it and spread it out on the table. The deed was old, the paper yellowed with age. The signature was clear, the ink faded, but still legible. As they examined it, Doc Elmer pointed to a small section at the bottom. Here, he said, tapping the paper. This clause was overlooked when Silas forged his documents. It proves he's been diverting water from the other homesteaders to his own ranch for years. The stranger studied the document closely. It was all there, the proof they needed to expose Silas and restore justice to Arabella and her children. We need to get this to the land registry office before dawn, the stranger said, folding the deed carefully and placing it back in the bag. Doc Elmer nodded. I'll go with you. I witnessed the original transaction. I can testify to its authenticity. Cal looked from one to the other, his face pale in the candlelight. What about me? What should I do? The deputy's uniform, the stranger said. Put it on. You'll come with us. When the time comes, you'll tell the truth about what Silas has been doing. Cal swallowed hard, but nodded. He disappeared into another room to change. The stranger turned to Doc Elmer. Are you sure about this? Silas won't go down without a fight. I'm sure, Doc Elmer said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. I've been waiting for this day for years, waiting for someone to stand up to him. The stranger nodded. Then he stood up, the medical bag held firmly in his hand. Let's go. The three of them walked through the dark streets toward the land registry office. As they approached, they could see two men standing guard outside, Silas's men. Stay here, the stranger said, his voice low. I'll handle this. He walked straight toward the building, the medical bag held loosely at his side. The two men stepped forward immediately, their hands resting on their weapons. Can I help you? One of them asked, his eyes scanning the stranger's face. The deed, the stranger said simply. I need it to return to its rightful owner. The men exchanged glances, then one of them laughed. You don't give orders here, stranger. Silas Crane is in there. He doesn't take kindly to people barging in. I'm not asking, the stranger said, his voice dropping. I'm telling you, either give me the deed or step aside. Before they could react, the door behind them opened. Silas Crane stepped out, flanked by 4 more armed men. Well, well, Silas said, a smirk playing on his lips. The troublemaker returns. I was wondering when you'd show your face again. The stranger didn't flinch. The deed, Silas. The original one. The one you stole. Silas's smile vanished. You have no idea what you're dealing with here. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, the stranger said, taking a step forward. I know about the water diversion. I know about the forged documents. And I have proof. Silas's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he opened the medical bag and pulled out the deed, holding it up for all to see. The paper was old and yellowed, but the signature was clear. Silas's face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "The question is," the stranger said, his voice cold, "what are you going to do about it?" The men around Silas tensed, their hands moving closer to their weapons. The stranger could feel the air crackle with tension. The moment stretched thin between them. Silas recovered quickly, his face hardening with anger. "Get him!" The four men moved forward, reaching for their guns, but the stranger was faster. He drew his rifle, the movement smooth and practiced, and leveled it at Silas. "Not so fast," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Anyone moves, and Silas here won't be walking away from this." The men hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons, but not quite touching them. Silas glared at the stranger, his face contorted with rage. "You can't win this," Silas spat. "I own this town. I own these men. I own everything." "Not anymore," Doc Elmer said, stepping forward. "I'm here to testify to the authenticity of that deed, and I'm not the only one." Cal appeared then, wearing his deputy uniform, his face set with determination. "I'm here too," Cal said. "I'm prepared to testify about Silas's illegal water diversion scheme, about how he's been stealing from the homesteaders for years." Silas stared at Cal, his face turning red with fury. "Traitor!" "Not a traitor," Cal said, his voice gaining strength. "A man who's finally doing what's right." The stranger kept his rifle trained on Silas, his finger on the trigger but not yet pulling it. He could see the fear in Silas's eyes now, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. "The deed," the stranger said again, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Silas hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. One of his men disappeared into the building, returning moments later with a document similar to the one the stranger held. "This is the official deed," Silas said, trying to regain his composure. "The one that proves the Blackwoods never had a proper claim." The stranger didn't even glance at it. "The original. Now." With a final glare at the stranger, Silas motioned to one of his men. The man retrieved another document from his coat pocket and handed it to the stranger. The stranger examined it carefully, comparing it to the one Doc Elmer had authenticated. It matched perfectly. "Arabella Blackwood is the rightful owner of this land," the stranger said, his voice ringing with authority in the night air. "And Silas Crane has been illegally diverting water from the homesteaders to his own ranch for years." He looked at the men surrounding Silas. "Anyone who wants to continue working for a man who starves children and steals from the poor can stay here. The rest of you are free to go." One by one, Silas's men lowered their weapons and stepped away. Even the two who had been standing guard at the door moved to join the others. Silas stood alone now, his face pale with rage and humiliation. The stranger walked forward and took the official papers from his hand. "The Blackwood homestead is yours again," the stranger said to Doc Elmer and Cal. "Make sure it stays that way." He turned to leave, but stopped when he heard Silas's voice. "You can't just ride away from this," Silas said, his voice tight with fury. The stranger turned back, his expression unreadable. "I'm not riding away. I'm riding to Arabella's homestead to make sure her children have food and water, Something you should have done weeks ago." Without another word, the stranger turned and walked away, leaving Silas standing alone in the moonlight, his empire of cruelty finally crumbling around him. The stranger rode toward Arabella's homestead as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The deed was safe in his saddlebag, the proof of ownership that would restore justice to a family that had suffered too long. He could see the small house in the distance, still dark against the pale sky, and he knew the children inside would be waking soon to another day of hunger. As he approached, he saw Arabella standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the weak light. She had been waiting for him, watching the road through the night. When she saw him approaching, her shoulders slumped with relief, though she still held herself with the caution of someone who had been disappointed too many times. "You have it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the still morning air. The stranger didn't answer with words. Instead, he dismounted and walked toward her, pulling the deed from his saddlebag. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The paper was old and yellowed, but the signature was clear and unmistakable. Arabella took the document, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. She scanned the pages quickly, her eyes widening as she recognized her husband's signature. Then she saw the clause at the bottom that had been overlooked, the one that proved Silas had been illegally diverting water from the homesteaders to his own ranch for years. "It's real," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's all here." The stranger nodded. "Doc Elmer will authenticate it officially, but this is enough to prove your claim." Just then, Doc Elmer and Cal approached from the road, Cal now wearing his deputy's uniform with pride. The early morning sun caught the brass buttons on his jacket, making them gleam in the light. "I've brought the official papers," Doc said, "and I've sent word to the land registry office. Silas's claims have been officially revoked." Arabella looked from the deed to the men who had helped her, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "My children," she said, her voice breaking. "They haven't eaten in days." Cal nodded. "I've already sent men to bring food from Silas's stores. He'll be paying for his crimes with his own resources." The stranger watched as Arabella's children came to the door, their small faces pale with hunger, but their eyes bright with hope. When they saw their mother holding the deed, their faces lit with joy. "The land is ours again," Arabella said, gathering her children close. "Our home is safe." The stranger stepped back, allowing the family their moment of reunion. He had done what he came to do. Justice had been served, and the innocent had been protected. There was nothing more for him here. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the homestead, the stranger turned to leave. He mounted his horse without a word, his movements practiced and efficient. He didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement. He simply rode away, heading west toward the next horizon, the next injustice that might need his attention. Behind him, Arabella stood with her children, the deed clutched in her hand. For the first time in weeks, there was food on the table and water in the well. The stranger had brought them more than just a document. He had brought them hope. Days later, word spread through Deadwood that Silas Crane had fled town in the dead of night, taking what little he could carry with him. His empire of cruelty had crumbled, and the homesteaders who had suffered under his rule were finally free. Doc Elmer became the new town physician, respected and admired for his courage in standing up to Silas. Deputy Cal Pierce enforced the law fairly, ensuring that such corruption would never take root again in Deadwood. Arabella's children grew strong and healthy on the land that was rightfully theirs. They would one day inherit the homestead, a legacy of justice, restored by a stranger with a red bandana who rode into town and changed everything. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.